You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. Hey everyone, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to talk to you for just a minute about High Sierra shower heads. I use them in my house because they're a water-efficient fixture, but I'm a big fan for other reasons as well, including their design and construction. They're made of solid metal. So this High Sierra shower head I have in my hand right now, you can tell that it's a quality, well-made product, unlike the vast majority of shower heads, which involve a lot of plastic in their construction. And that's something we need less of, right? Less consumer products with plastic in them. The other awesome thing is their nozzle design. It's a unique patented nozzle that's not going to clog like so many other shower heads. The other thing about this nozzle is that it will work in low pressure. You'll still get a strong, powerful, but water-efficient shower. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by Flume. It's the perfect device for tracking your home's water use in real time on your smartphone. It's so easy to use. You just attach a small device to your water meter using a band, the same way you put a watch on your wrist. Then you connect to Wi-Fi, you download the app, and you're up and running. It's as simple as that. You don't need a plumber. You don't need to cut into any of your pipes or water lines. Very easy to set up. Then you can set water budgets, how much you want to use each day or week. It'll keep track of that. It'll tell you what's going on in your house with water use minute by minute. It'll send alerts to you if there's excessive water use or if it suspects a leak. In fact, when I installed Flume at my house, it told me almost right away about a leak. I was losing a gallon of water every 6 minutes. I'm honestly not sure when I would have found that without Flume. You can use promo code WATERLOOP for 10% off at flumewater.com.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Very excited for a conversation today about making water decisions, water management decisions, especially around groundwater, and the role of science and data and tech in that decision making. Have three guests for this episode. I have Ben Kerr. He is the founder and CEO of Foundry Spatial. Ben, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Travis.
I have Melissa Rohde. She is a groundwater scientist with the Nature Conservancy. Awesome title. Melissa, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And I have Tom Gleeson. He is an associate professor at the University of Victoria, along with some many other hats he wears. Tom, glad you could come on too.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks, Travis.
So let's maybe start out with examples, because I think I first connected with Ben and his folks, and the way that they're using science and data and tech tools in British Columbia and Alberta to make decisions about water. What are some examples of how you're doing this? What's your approach?
Yeah, so we're focused at helping people get the information that they need to make smart decisions about human use of water. So it's typically a hard thing to do. We don't know how much water there is everywhere across the landscape. So it often is a complex process involving scientists and geologists and engineers typically to come up with estimates for locations in terms of what the water supply and demand looks like. So what we've done is we built a software platform that helps people just engage with the information that they need to make decisions. So the software framework takes all the data, takes scientific models, takes databases of existing water rights, and puts all that stuff together into a really easy to use format so that people can just get the information they need to make smart decisions.
And I guess a big challenge is it's a challenge just knowing how much water there is and where it is and how it moves around. I mean, is that sounds oversimplified, but is that kind of the gist of it, huh? Especially when you're talking about groundwater.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So there's a ton of data that's out there, but it's typically hard to access, hard to understand, and hard to actually make it relevant to the decision that you're considering. So we're just trying to really kind of lift everybody up in terms of their ability to access and understand, robust science-based information about water sustainability.
Yeah. So what are some ways that you've kind of gone about this up there in British Columbia and Alberta?
Yeah, so so it started off as as really just as a science project to see if we could come up with detailed models to provide a good representation of the hydrology across large areas. Once we satisfied ourselves with that, the next question was, how do we get this get this information to the people that need it, and those are people like decision makers in government. Those are the water user community, so a whole range of industries, and it's also all of the concerned public out there who wants to see that their water is managed sustainably, so that it continues to provide the services that they enjoy, whether that's their drinking water, recreational activities, or just the support of the ecosystems that they value. So we took these models that we developed and then adapted them into a web framework which lets people interact in a really simple manner, same as you would on Google Maps or something like that, or Airbnb. You're sort of interested in the specific place that you're interested in, and that's all you really need to know. So you can go in and choose the specific location on a stream or in an aquifer, and then acquire really detailed, specific information that describes what's going on at that location.
So in Alberta and in BC, there's been some decisions made or management of water, but using these tools.
Yeah, so they use it. So when they're reviewing new applications, or if if a water user is looking for a viable source of water, it helps them in the planning process, and really kind of lets people jump over that. The people will say 80% of the time on a project is typically involved finding the data that you need, and massaging it, getting it in the right shape so you can actually understand it. So we try and cut out that 80% of time so that people can really spend more time on the high value pieces, interpreting what it means, thinking about the implications of what they're doing, consulting with stakeholders and other interested parties. So everybody can kind of proceed from a solid base of understanding about the context at a location.
These decisions are made looking at both surface water and groundwater. Just kind of curious about how that works.
Yeah, so we've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years now, and the primary focus at the outset was on surface water. So understanding, how and when water moves through watersheds, to streams and rivers and through lakes and wetlands, with really not much consideration of the groundwater aspect. So about 4 years ago, I met Tom, and we started having discussions about what the potential would be to incorporate groundwater dynamics, groundwater sustainability metrics into these decision tools, so that people could have a more holistic view of what's going on in terms of water across the landscape, because the impacts of groundwater withdrawals, like over withdrawal of groundwaters, can be substantial, especially in terms of how they can impact stream flow during low flow times of the year. So that, when in the middle of summer, when it's been dry for a couple months, yet the streams are still flowing, the only reason that there's water in those streams is because of the supply from groundwater there. So if you overuse groundwater and withdraw too much of it, then it'll lower the groundwater levels, and then that groundwater won't flow into the streams. And if the water dries up in the stream, that can have substantial impacts to communities that depend on it, to the animals that live in the streams, that there's nowhere they can go if the water goes away. So it's a really important additional aspect to consider.
Well, I want to ask Tom, what are the information challenges for groundwater? In my non-science speak, I was like, oh, it's tough to know how much there is and where it is. Could you help out from a more scientific perspective and explain, what the challenges are for groundwater knowledge?
Well, I think, Travis, you're not that far off, actually. You're pretty much, even the most world-renowned hydrogeologist would basically describe it in a roughly similar way. I think a great way to think about groundwater is that it's an invisible and undervalued resource. So that has those two aspects of really profound informational challenges. It means it's hard to collect information. And even possibly more profoundly, is it's sometimes hard to care. We don't see it. We can't see it. It's invisible. So a number of organizations have been proactive and developed best practices and good systems. And I'll talk about a few of those, but also highlight some of the challenges. A good example for your audience in the United States is the USGS, which maintains a strong national water observation and groundwater monitoring well network, and has for years. But our colleagues, Scott Giesecco and Deb Perrone at University of California, Santa Barbara, started realizing a few years ago that the data in there is only part of the picture. And they actually spent multiple years trying to individually contact each state and collect groundwater information. This has been literally months and months of effort over years. And they still have a few states that don't have data provided. So this just shows you how challenging it is to collect even the most basic information about groundwater, like when a well was drilled and how deep it was drilled and what it was drilled into. And these informational challenges just compound significantly when we talk or think about anywhere else in the world. A few other nations have robust groundwater observation systems, but many nations around the world have very patchwork or insufficient groundwater monitoring and significant informational challenges.
Yeah. Melissa, working for the Nature Conservancy, groundwater scientist, you're based in California. From a practical water management, standpoint, how does knowing more, having a lot more data about groundwater, being able to monitor it, how do you achieve that, and then how is it used?
Yeah. So more information is always helpful with management, but since more information costs money, that means that we need to prioritize data collection and analyses around very discrete goals and management decisions. So in the case of sustainable groundwater management being a goal, where groundwater is being managed to be shared for current and future societal, economic, and environmental uses, that means that we need to have an understanding of how groundwater conditions are impacting wells, streams, and ecosystems. And so the big issue is that under many management regimes, there are significant data gaps on how groundwater conditions are affecting people and nature. And so there are a couple reasons for this. In addition to what you all have already alluded to, that groundwater is already a technically complex thing in and of itself. The first issue is that not all groundwater users are created equal, which means that not all data is created equal. And so some user groups have much larger political and economic power over others. And this means that where we decide ultimately to place new wells or which data to collect in monitoring networks are made by a select and privileged few in the decision-making process. And this is because it takes time and resources to attend public meetings and comment on large technical documents. And essentially, it creates this large participation barrier for some stakeholders, such as disadvantaged communities and the environment. And often, data that would help monitor groundwater impacts to these types of users are not prioritized. Second is that sustainable groundwater management is transdisciplinary. It draws on expertise in the sciences, engineering, policy and law, economics, and ecology. And so, at least here in California, a lot of the groundwater sustainability plans that are being created and which include monitoring network proposals or plans they're being drafted by engineering firms. And so that's why stakeholder involvement is really key, because if they're not in place, if stakeholders aren't involved to provide feedback on monitoring or data gaps, they go unacknowledged. And as a whole, we've all heard this adage, maybe everyone's heard this adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. But in fact, what's actually happening is that the absence of evidence is often being used as the evidence of absence. So, for example, in many places, shallow monitoring wells along streams are a huge data gap in California for mapping interconnected streams. But instead of filling those gaps and managing streams under the potential circumstance that they may in fact be interconnected, they're getting mapped as not interconnected at all. And so this is extremely dangerous in undermining sustainability goals. And so what I'm trying to say here is that having a comprehensive understanding of data gaps along with a healthy dose of the precautionary principle is just as important as having a lot of groundwater data when making management decisions.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting. Some great phrases there that I'm going to have to try to incorporate into my discussions and conversations. Really catchy stuff. I want to just kind of dig a little bit more, no pun intended, on how to get this information and do the monitoring, especially of groundwater. I mean, Ben has talked about kind of the tools they have, and I think you all have touched on it a little bit, but yeah, could we go deeper? Like how are you guys really trying to look at this groundwater? I'm curious.
There's essentially three opportunities I see. We have, as I mentioned earlier, that not all data is created equal. So the first opportunity is filling a funding gap that usually comes along with having, to support the collection and the dissemination of information that help support these data gaps for traditionally marginalized groundwater users. And so this could be funding for installing shallow monitoring wells around streams and in ecosystems to monitor impacts to groundwater pumping, or more water quality monitoring in rural wells, for example. The second is to enable data sharing across sectors. So, for example, the oil and gas sector has a pretty good understanding of deep aquifers that are hydraulically connected to shallower aquifer systems that are primarily being managed for providing water supply. But since it's very costly and difficult to monitor deeper portions of the basin, groundwater managers would significantly benefit from having access to this data, but currently do not have access because of proprietary restrictions. Another example is like having state and federal resource agencies such as like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that already have long-term existing monitoring programs for a range of species. Working with DSAs to marry that data with hydrologic data to understand how groundwater is potentially impacting those ecosystems. And then the last, which kind of relates to my first point, is to build easily accessible tools, such as the one that Ben was telling you about, to assess impacts to streams and ecosystems that can be used at both the project level and also regional planning purposes. And so in the case of California, groundwater remains completely unregulated in large portions of the state. And so analytical tools that could help assess whether or not development and construction projects are having adverse impacts to the environment, such as during like environmental compliance reporting, such as CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, would be really helpful in preventing adverse impacts to streams and ecosystems, especially in the absence of regulation. Yeah. Which is the case locally.
Echoing on the last point Melissa was raising as well, and dig a little bit deeper as you asked, Travis, on some of the science work that we've been doing right around these easily accessible tools that Melissa was just describing, and she mentioned we've been testing analytical solutions. So we've developed new tools in my research group in collaboration with Foundry, Spatial, to highly simplify and make it much more fast to make these types of first order decisions around what happens when we pump a well and how that impacts stream flow that is mostly relevant for environmental flows. So we, instead of creating highly complex and expensive regional numerical models, we use simple analytical solutions in a mapping context that are linked to multiple streams to get a first order estimate of how pumping impacts streams and in these interconnected waterways that are important in California, British Columbia, and many other places.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Tom, about that. Just a little bit more about the connection between surface water and groundwater. Not everybody is a scientist or has the knowledge that you guys have, and the idea that these what's up top and what's down below are actually, there's a lot of connections there. Could you talk about that and how that connection factors into management of water?
Yeah, thank you. So, decades ago, groundwater and surface water were considered kind of two different worlds. And throughout the 90s and 2000s, people really advocated, and there was a great important USGS report called Groundwater and Surface Water, a Single Resource. And I think that's an important thing that everyone kind of now recognizes. Probably the most obvious example that Ben already discussed was when, in the summertime, when there is no significant rainfall or there's not a reservoir upstream. If there is water in that stream, it's probably groundwater. Groundwater supports base flow in rivers around the world, and it is highly important. But unfortunately, groundwater and surface water move at different speeds and kind of over different kind of spatial patterns. So surface water in streams is fast and localized. It's always in the stream channel, whereas groundwater is very slow and is very distributed throughout the landscape. So these kind of fundamental differences in how the water resource is distributed affects how information can be gathered about this interconnected resource. So what it means is that stream gauges on rivers are very easy, relatively easy to install and gather information that integrates the stream flow over a whole watershed, whereas a single well, as Melissa was alluding to earlier, often don't exist, and they, in many cases, they don't represent the full condition of the groundwater under a watershed. So what that means in general is that we need many more wells, and we need, because groundwater moves so slowly, we need much longer records in time, both of which we don't have. So the overall message is that, yes, groundwater and surface water are entirely connected. They move at different time scales, and they have different kind of information requirements to be able to understand and manage them better.
So, Tom, I'm curious about, the emerging uses of science and tech in groundwater management. What's kind of happening now to do a better job of that?
Yeah, two major initiatives in the last 5 to 10 years that have really are really important and really changing how we, hopefully, how we manage water is what's called Socio Hydrology. So there's a whole new field that's emerging that studies the interactions between humans and water. And quite frankly, it tries to also make hydrologic science and all the science and engineering we do in academia more useful for society and decision makers. So that's the first one. And second is the whole movement towards open science, and which is trying to make our scientific results, methods, and publishing all more publicly available. So these two kind of streams, and pun intended, I appreciate how you brought up puns earlier, Travis, that I see really growing and becoming more important in science, both come together around these emerging technologies.
Yeah.
So one of the examples is these online tools that we've been talking about that are useful for mapping water resources in British Columbia and Alberta and emerging in California. And so these bring together making scientific data in a socially relevant way that are easily usable and digestible for water managers, and having all the results and methods in a very open and transparent way. So I think these are the these two thrusts of science, data, technology are coming together in these water tools.
Well, as a longtime communications person, I'm really fascinated to have just learned that term, Socio Hydrology, and it makes a ton of sense. Something else I'm going to have to educate myself on further and use. Since you mentioned the tools piece, I want to just go to Ben for a minute, because I'm also a big fan of maps and graphics and data visualization. And we know that humans are very visual creatures. What difference does it make to have these interfaces like the ones you guys have developed be so visually appealing?
Yeah, thanks, Travis. It's so I'll answer that question in a maybe a bit of a roundabout way. So we, over the last 5 or 10 years, or up to 15 years since Google Maps was introduced, we've engaged with Maps much more intimately on the commercial products that we use in our day-to-day lives. So products like Google Maps, products like Airbnb. There's the mapping component is a key part of the information, and that quick and rapid access to be able to find, a restaurant that you're looking for or a place to stay in a different town. People have a really high expectation in terms of how easy that's going to be, and there's a big rift between kind of the user experience that people are growing more accustomed to in their day-to-day lives, and how technical tools or science-focused tools, or like technical mapping applications that you might use, from a city or whatnot. There's a long way to go between where those are at and where they need to be to provide the same kind of user experience for people. So there's a lot of studies out there in terms of how quick you need to deliver information to people, especially the first time they visit a tool, to give them satisfaction, that they're doing the right thing and that they're getting value out of the time that they're investing in it. So a lot of times, like, the internet's littered with tools that had great intentions, that people had a good idea, they had interesting data that they wanted to share with the world. But when the first time you go there and you spend, a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes clicking around and trying to figure out how to do something, and then if you can't figure it out at the first time, you're highly unlikely to come back again. So one of the highest benefits of these tools is really in making the science and the data transparent for those people who should be able to engage in the discussions around management of water. And so we really look to those tools that are out there and borrow design patterns in terms of user interaction and interface design to bring that same kind of experience to people who are looking for technical information. And we do that through a couple of ways, by borrowing those some sort of techniques, and then also by providing kind of a hierarchy of information. So, it's engageable and understandable for people who don't have a background in science or engineering, and then progressively provides more detail down to hyper specific variability and frequency statistics and those kind of things for the technical folks who have more complex needs in terms of information.
Well, I also want to turn to Melissa here. California, is under a water crunch, has been for a while, will be for the foreseeable future, right? Groundwater is a critical resource. Just curious about, as California looks to groundwater, as they try to make policy decisions, management decisions, what role, these types of tools might play?
Yeah, they play a really big, I think they have a potential to play a really large role. So we have this law that passed in 2014 called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and it applies to primarily large alluvial aquifers that are existing in the Central Valley. And so there are large portions of the state that are completely unregulated. This is mostly like fractured hard rock and volcanic aquifers in the coastal and Sierras, the low and very low priority basins in the desert regions, and then also very deep groundwater, which is considered brackish underneath these large alluvial basins in the Mississippi Valley. And so there are a lot of opportunities. So even in the absence of SGMA regulation, there are other laws that are in effect and compliance that needs to be done in order to ensure that new proposed projects aren't going to have an impact on the environment. However, those tools are not available. So, for example, if somebody was trying to develop a project in a fractured hard rock aquifer up in the coastal mountain range, for example, and they want to know what the potential impacts are to the streams and the ecosystems, it's very difficult to figure that out because there aren't large models, numerical models that are in existence. There's no sustainability agency to reach out to understand how that project might impact the ecosystem. And so having like a web-based tool that uses integrates analytical approaches to understand potential impacts of groundwater pumping to the streams and ecosystems would be absolutely transformational in giving information to people that are trying to understand the impacts of different projects. And so that's one use. But then also in California, I think as humans, there's a natural tendency to always try to evade the law, right? And so, or try to find a way where you have more flexibility. And so with SGMA, you're going to have these pumping cuts. And so there is likely going to be a translocation of pumping issues outside of these SGMA basins to these unregulated areas. And so one example of this is with cannabis cultivation. So cannabis cultivators, it's recently legal to grow cannabis, and they're junior water rights holders. And so they have less priority to access surface water. And so previously it was assumed that cannabis cultivators were using surface water primarily, but then there was a survey done that found that cannabis cultivation, 60% of cannabis cultivators were using groundwater for irrigation. And so there are interim water use regulations for legal cannabis cultivation in California that prohibit surface water diversion during the dry season in order to protect salmon, but they don't limit groundwater use right now. And so this makes it an attractive water source to be using groundwater instead of surface water. And so there's an opportunity with the State Water Resources Control Board's interim cannabis cultivation policy to look at, if there's tools available for them to assess whether or not cannabis pumpers could have an impact on nearby streams. That would be very helpful in the absence of other groundwater regulation.
Sure. Fascinating stuff. So much good information and perspective from you all. I have to acknowledge that the incredible work that Ben did to have Victoria Waterworks behind him there. That's well played. But thanks to all three of you for the perspective and information. So much to dig into. But appreciate all you shared today. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis.
Thanks for having us, Travis.
Waterloop.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode. A special thanks to Waterloop supporters Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish way to save energy, water, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Save 20% with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com. Waterloop is also sponsored by Flume, the smart water monitor that tracks your home's water use in real time and provides data on your smartphone. Save 10% with promo code WATERLOOP at flumewater.com. If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop.